welcome to our panel discussion on how Glamnetic achieves data-driven marketing. We're looking forward to diving into some great strategies on this topic and learning more from our speaker here. So today we have Margaret Fortner. Margaret is the head of growth at Glamnetic, one of the fastest growing beauty brands in the US. Across both agency and in-house roles, her primary focus has been on the intersection of data and creativity to drive positive growth outcomes. In her current role, she oversees the acquisition, retention, web, and Amazon teams at Glamnetic. And then Peter Fishman is the CEO and co-founder of Mozart Data. He has over a decade of experience running data and data adjacent teams at startups in a variety of industries, including gaming, social, HR and benefits, real estate, and cannabis. When he realized he was building the same types of modern data stacks at each company, he teamed up with a close friend to start Mozart Data in 2020 and make it easy for anyone to gather data, automate reporting, and generate insights. He also co-founded Bacon Hot Sauce in 2010, which sold hundreds of thousands of bottles of hot sauce. So how this will work, our panelists will kind of go over some of the topics that we've got going here, and then we're going to reserve some time for a Q&A at the end. Zoom does have a feature for this, so you should be able to see a Q&A button on your actual Zoom, and feel free to submit questions you have at any time, and we'll get to them at the end. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Peter.
Cody, thanks. Margaret, thanks for joining us. Let's just dive in. Maybe you know, obviously Cody shared your bio, but would love just to start by learning a little bit more about your career background and how data has played a role.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you guys for having me. Super excited to be here. So in terms of my career background, I've been in kind of the growth, performance marketing, et cetera, space, both on the direct to consumer and the business to business side of things. I started out in the agency side. I actually started in paid search. So I think part of why, data is so important to me in terms of how I approach every type of marketing is because, for anyone who's familiar with paid search marketing or not, it's one of the more kind of data driven sides of marketing that you can have out there, just because they give you so much data. So, anytime you type something into Google, if you click on an ad, or even if you don't click on an ad, if someone is running keywords that map to whatever you typed in, they can see that. So, people like me, when I was running paid search campaigns, are able to use that sort of data to make, very deep, targeted kind of academic is probably the best term I can use, decisions. So kind of having that much data to start out with in my career was really powerful. But, I ended up expanding into paid social, display, digital TV. And then later in my career, when I moved to the brand side, starting to work across, retention marketing with email, SMS, app, those sorts of things, getting into email and working on, or getting into Amazon and working on web as well. So I think the search marketer in me is still there. I think search might still be my favorite platform, even though I'm not using it as much anymore in my day-to-day. So I think that's what really led to, kind of this love for data, on top of working with really strong data-driven agencies early in my career who really prioritized that, built out whole teams that were focused on media analytics, utilizing multi-touch attribution tools early on, back in the 2010s. I know they're becoming cool again, but they had a bit of a heyday back then too. So I think that just kind of made it very important to me, and it's something I've carried forward.
All right, so going a little off script, the thing that's kind of tops on everybody's mind is sort of the shifting macro economy as it relates to jobs, inflation, all of these things. But as it relates to sort of marketing, have you seen a shift in marketing dollars towards more performance-oriented marketing? I know that that's your background, but I'm sort of interested in your perspective in-house.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say yes and no. I think there are shifts within where the performance dollars are going, and also what's being considered kind of performance marketing versus branded marketing. And your ability to invest in branded marketing really comes down to how you set yourself up to succeed from kind of a data tracking standpoint. So if anything, and I speak to a lot of other growth nerds, if anything, people are potentially spending less on performance marketing and testing things like branding a bit more and saying, okay, it used to make sense to put all of my money into performance marketing because I knew exactly how this audience and this creative were doing at all times. And I could almost one-to-one tie it to the results I was seeing on my back end from a revenue standpoint. But post iOS, you're just not seeing that anymore. So I think people are kind of willing to take those risks or quote unquote risks and test things like TV, billboard, magazines, like direct mail, those sorts of things. Because it's no longer like a simple math problem of if I put $1 million into performance, I'm going to get this, whereas it wouldn't make sense to put this much money into this. So I think it kind of depends on the brand, but I feel like people are getting more creative and willing to test more things, whether that's new platforms within performance or whether that's more brand focused marketing.
Okay, so one of the things that strikes me just like a minute into talking to you is just how like data oriented you are. Obviously, it's been such a cornerstone of your career to date. Can we just sort of talk a little bit about the rise? You sort of mentioned yourself doing sort of a lot of that sort of growth function, the rise of that really data savvy growth marketer. Is that a trend that obviously we've seen a lot of it over the last decade, but kind of how have you thought of it kind of actually living that sort of rise?
Yeah, not to sound too self-supporting here, but I talk to people who are kind of getting into growth or earlier in their marketing career, and I say, to really differentiate yourself as a growth marketer, you need to have both the data-driven side of your brain and the creative side of your brain. And the people who are successful are the people who kind of live at the intersection of that. And I think creative is somewhat easier to kind of get a hold on. You just get enough reps in it, and you just look at the times and you see, okay, I'm consistently seeing these brands are doing this, and I know that these are brands that are doing well. So I think that the creative makes sense there. And then there's also just like a sense of things. You can look at a website feature and you can say, I think this makes sense as a consumer. We're all consumers. So there are certain kind of creative things that you just learn and get reps over time. I think people underinvest in developing those data skill sets, especially if you're working at, a bigger company, because you go, oh, I have these data analysts and engineers and everything. I think everyone should become at least, get their data 101 training and just be able to kind of self-serve a bit, because then it teaches you to ask better questions of the superpowered data people. So I think that has been like a differentiating factor, and I think I'm starting to see that more and more when I see the people who are kind of in and around my generation of people who are coming into like leadership growth roles. You have a lot of people actually who I know who are coming from consulting or finance who are getting into these growth roles, and obviously that over indexes data more than I do. So I think it's starting to be recognized a bit more as having a lot of value in this function.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we think about at Mozart is that sort of growing population of really data savvy folks without, say, a data engineering background or without that sort of classical training in like data science, but like really being able to move the ball in operating functions. Obviously, yourself sort of fitting that mold to a T, which is why I wanted to have this conversation. Maybe you could dive into a little bit about not necessarily who you are as a person, but like how you came to be at Glamnetic, right? So like how, why is there this role? Why were you relevant for it? Like what, effectively the why of this growth role.
Yeah, so I think this growth role really comes down to a couple of things. One is kind of that data and creative intersection that I spoke to earlier. So, I sit across the editing team for, all of our video ads and editing. I work closely with our graphic design team. I sit across like email design and things like that. But I also, worked closely with our team as we were building out all of our data infrastructures and everything. So that's one piece. The second piece I think is kind of, I'm seeing more and more companies unify, acquisition and retention under one individual or one kind of core function, because I think if your acquisition and your retention strategies are not aligned, then you're going to acquire a lot of, really weak cohorts by running a ton of sales on the acquisition side, or you're just going to be, creating unrealistic expectations by running deep discounts to returning customers, and they're never going to come back again. You essentially need to have those working together as a really strong function. So I feel like most growth teams I know nowadays are unifying acquisition and retention. So it's the data and creative, it's the acquisition, retention, unification, and then, a lot of what I do is project management. That's the less glamorous side of the job, but I think having that like data infrastructure makes the project management decisions more effective, and kind of understanding like, all right, this person has this skill set, so they should do this. This person has this skill set, so they should do this. And I also think just, spending enough time in data, it makes your brain work in a linear, in a good way manner that kind of helps with, guiding teams forward.
All right. So unsurprisingly, this is a data-driven marketing webinar. I want to dive into data infrastructure. What are you doing for data? Talk to me about kind of your decision for today, and then sort of maybe some of the career evolution there. We can do this in one piece at a time. First of all, what are you doing today on the data side?
Yeah, so we have invested a lot into data. When I came in, that was one of the first things we started building out. And as anyone who's built out a really strong data infrastructure knows, it can take a little time, even just from a strategic planning standpoint to start. But we utilize Looker as our data visualization software, we utilize a data warehouse, and then we utilize an ETL. I can get into the specifics of which ones we use, but so we have a great kind of team that, builds out the pipes and does all the DBT transformations and that sort of good jazz. And then, we have a lot of our leadership team has actually become comfortable enough with Looker that they're able to, go in and build explores on their own, build their own dashboards, like dive more deeply into the data. So I think that's been really important. So that's where I am now. Before this, I was kind of utilizing less comprehensive solutions. I used a tool called Supermetrics a lot that generated, essentially allowed us to, I used to call it like API for dummies, because it basically meant that anyone who had a decent idea of kind of how to construct queries and then, translate things into, whether it was Sheets or Google Data Studio, it was just a good way to kind of build that piping. So I would build that into Sheets dashboards or hooking into Google Data Studio directly and building within there. That was both on the agency side as well as some consulting that I used to do in the past. But going back even further, I think I was kind of spoiled to start with the media analytics team that we had. We were utilizing DataRama for all of our build outs. So back then I had people who are kind of doing the core build outs for me, but because it was a bit of a bigger agency, things move more slowly. So I'm not always the most patient person in the world. So there are times where I was kind of like just pulling the data and playing around with it myself and doing all the good slicing and dicing type stuff just to get the answers more quickly. So DataRama to Supermetrics to Looker.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. You're today, kind of using, a stack, a BI Viz tool. You're using sort of a data warehouse. You're gathering data from multiple sources. You're using a stack that looks like it could be, in any function. It's not necessarily like a marketing point solution. It's not, necessarily like a finance or an operating, or, it's like a solution that just sort of generalizes. Why that, as opposed to very tailored solutions that, that basically are pretty common in the field or discipline?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because I'm not the only one using these sorts of data systems. That's really why we leaned into it. We wanted to build a system that was applicable and usable by operators at different functions and different kind of levels of comfort with data, versus like if you're using something like Supermetrics or any other kind of similar, API hooking tool, there's a little bit of a learning curve, and things can break, and then you have to grab the one person who's really good at it to come in and like fix the queries, and then there can be lots of panic going on during that period of time. Not that this was a specific experience I had with clients or anything, but I think having a more generalized solution that can hook into a bunch of different platforms, and where we can build different views for different people who need to see different things on a regular basis, that's kind of where we landed where we did.
All right, I do want to make clear to the audience that was not like a setup. Obviously, like I very religiously believe in essentially setting up a data infrastructure that's usable across the operators and data users of the company. Obviously, that's what we passionately do and believe in at Mozart. The one thing I'll challenge Margaret on is, of course, it doesn't necessarily take months to get this all sorted and figured out. One can do this quite quickly with the right tooling. But I want to actually sort of dive into the real sort of practical applications and try to talk a little bit more about what data-driven marketing means, what you're doing, what's involved there?
Yeah. I think there are kind of, when I think about data-driven marketing, there's kind of three pieces to it. One is how you're capturing the data. So are you setting yourselves up to pull in the information that you need? Then that's, as simple as UTM tracking, like pixel placement, all that sort of stuff. Like, are you building the right hook-ins or your ETL to pull into your warehouse and then push whatever? That's the sort of basic stuff. Though that can also include things like if you have a comprehensive naming convention that allows you to, see what's really working and slice and dice across like ads and things like that. My team knows that's something I harp on constantly. Then the second piece is the kind of visualization of that. So are you setting up the right dashboards to show you what you need to see quickly, accurately, efficiently, flexibly? I think being able to, adjust the date range for things is a kind of underrated differentiator that you have when you're doing data visualization tools versus just pulling into Excel. And then the last piece is kind of what you're doing with that. I also use this kind of like framework of the what, the why, and the what's next when I think about leveraging data and marketing. So the what is, what happened? Your CPA went up by 40% week over week. Okay, the why did this happen? I saw my CPM go up by 40%, all else held equal. Okay, what's next? This probably means that I need to either widen my audiences or introduce new creative. So that's a super simple example, but I think that's how you really think about like being a level 1 data-driven marketer and being like a level 3+ data-driven marketer, because the basic people are just going to stop at, okay, CPA was up 40% week over week. That sucks. But if you really want to be successful, it's about taking those next subsequent steps. And I think it becomes easier to make those subsequent steps if you set yourself up well from, a data platform standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't want to date myself, but you're not sounding like someone that's a marketing analytics leader to me. You're just sounding like an analytics leader to me, right? Which is to say, setting it up so that and thinking about sort of the future usage of of your data and sort of solving things in sort of human consumable fashion, and all of these things are really sort of, again, a much more general approach to analytics problems, and the way you're sort of breaking down the problems. That it happens to be that your expertise is marketing, but this is sort of universal across. Maybe we could dive into some classic areas of marketing that you're tackling. Like, I mean, you mentioned sort of the heyday of attribution tools. When we think about sort of measuring effective marketing, what are some of the things that are sort of most important? I'm sort of out of the loop. What are the things that are most important these days?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on what your business is, but from the most basic standpoint, there's going to be some sort of customer acquisition cost metric, of course, and that's there are different ways that you can look at that. Like a discussion I have to have all the time with my team is being specific about saying CAC, customer acquisition cost, versus CPA. Because CAC is kind of a global metric. CAC is not controlled by attribution. CAC is simply all that you spent that day divided by the total number of new customers that came in that day. We're using Shopify. Shopify automatically tags every customer as a first-time or returning customer. So super easy to answer CAC. CPA, as I think of it, is the platform CPA. So what does Facebook say it costs to acquire a customer on a daily basis? So that's when you start kind of getting into the concept of triangulation of attribution systems, because what Shopify says might be very different from what Facebook says, might be very different from what TikTok says. And the other complicating piece in that is they're all running off their own pixels. So they're all going to claim credit for the same 2 customers. If I see an ad for a pair of Nike sneakers on Monday on Facebook, I don't click on it. Then I see an ad on TikTok, I do click on that, and then I still don't convert, but then I'm searching sneakers on Google, and then I click on a Google organic search result. All these different platforms are going to say different things. Like Facebook, if you have view through attribution turned on, is going to take credit. TikTok may or may not take credit because they have a weird pixel, but let's pretend that they have a functional normal pixel and they're going to take credit too. But then if I'm like, okay, I have Google Analytics on my site and I'm running my UTMs improperly and everything, Google Analytics based on last click attribution is going to give all of that credit to the Google organic search. But that Google organic search would not have happened without the work of Facebook and TikTok. So I think one of the big pieces of iOS data loss led to underinvestment in these performance marketing platforms. Because if you're, like, okay, I can't trust the platforms anymore, I'm just gonna pull back and rely on GA, you're probably underinvesting there. And I know I'm getting in the weeds a little bit here, but so I think it's super important.
I love the weeds here. I do want to dive into that, right? Like, yeah. I'm like, oh, great. Like, I just made one sale and, I have 2.4 people taking credit for the sale. Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned, the keyword here is triangulation. So there is no explicit like formula, like the cube root of Google plus like, the square root of TikTok and, 4 times, whatever, Facebook to the third. I understand that there's no explicit formula for you. Mm-hmm. How might you, so break down triangulate, this is okay. I think this is a webinar probably filled with nerds. So I do like, I love sort of listening to the professional progression, but here we've sort of honed in on something that's pretty universal. And I'd love to, have a perspective on it.
Yeah, so I think kind of at a high level, you want to arm yourself with as many sources of truth as possible, as long as they're not going to become overwhelming. Because if you have, 50 different data sources, then you do have to create that kind of formula. And then you're going to need someone a lot smarter than I am to kind of build that for you. But, I think some pretty basic sources of truth that we all have available for the most part to us are, platform data being one, Shopify or whatever core backend platform. Let's keep this in the D2C universe just because it's easier. A lot of the D2C brands are on Shopify. So Shopify will give you some data there. If you're using Google Analytics, which most people are, you'll have Google Analytics data. They do have multiple attribution like models that you can look like within there, but most people are just looking at GA last click, which is a 28-day last click window for the most part. And then another thing that a lot of brands will use is kind of a customer self-reporting attribution survey. How did you hear about us? That sort of thing. So that's another source of data that you have. And then I know a lot of brands are starting to lean back into the multi-touch attribution space. There are a couple different tools out there, but a lot of times what you'll have there is a unified pixel and a unified BTM, and then they're doing their own kind of deduplication, similar to what GA does, but with view-through attribution included. So you got those 5 different sources of truth. You can probably have a gut feeling of, all right, Google Analytics is going to maybe be the most conservative out of everything when I'm looking at my core platforms. Shopify may also be relatively conservative. Pre-iOS, the platforms were always crazy over reporting, but now they're still over reporting, but not as much. How did you hear about us? That's probably going to underreport a bit. And then my multi-touch attribution system, I would say might over-report a little bit. So it's just kind of taking all of those. And ideally, you're setting up your tagging and tracking well enough that you can look at least in most of these systems, things down to even the ad level. And then I can say, okay, Facebook says my ad has a 1.1. My multi-touch attribution system says it has a 1.3. Google Analytics says it has a 0.4. Shopify's a bit wonky about UTMs, but let's say it has a 0.6. And then, 50% of my customers said they came through on Facebook yesterday. So then you can kind of go through there and say, all right, based on the trends that I'm seeing, how this is changing day over day, I think the true ROAS of this ad is probably a 0.85, something like that. So it's not a hard and fast math formula, but there is some sort of degree. And I think there is some gut in it. I think that there's a marriage of gut and data that can and should be had. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I would think about triangulation. Other companies may have additional data systems that they're looking at, or may not use some of these, may think they're completely off, but I think more data systems up to a certain point are better.
I have to say, like, I was just like blown away by that answer. And like, let me start off by disagreeing with something that you said initially, which is that an even more sophisticated approach would, suck in 50 data sources and have some sort of explicit formula. I think of, the state of the art today as being largely knowing and understanding the biases of each of these sort of systems that you're using, and doing that triangulation, like sort of a more sophisticated approach to me is really understanding sort of how all the clues aggregate into, a sort of a best guess. It's sort of like almost like the wisdom of crowds, where when you like, crowdsource everybody guessing the number of M&Ms in a jar, they get like the right one. But if you can actually slightly bias it and say, well, this person sort of tends to guess too many M&Ms, and this person tends to be too conservative, you can do even better than sort of just the simple average. So just, right off the bat, this is not a field that I'm in any way an expert in. So really just the way that I react to your answer is, wow, that is really incredibly sophisticated, even if it's not to the point of you've automated yourself out of a job. So I think that's one piece. I know we have a few folks in the audience. I want to sort of reiterate something that Cody mentioned, which is feel free to ask questions. I'm just getting sort of caught up in certain things that Margaret's saying that I want to learn a little bit more about. So, I just think with respect to attribution, that type of approach sounds right, sort of aggregating all of the clues to have a best guess and a directionally correct answer. Something at, sort of the Glamnetic stage now, probably are the world's like absolute largest DTC brands able to do something like formulaic? Probably, maybe, but like you have to be at a pretty incredible scale probably to hit that point. Let me transition. I want to get into the TLAs, the acronyms here, and I've heard you use this term ETL a bunch. I'm loosely familiar. I'm familiar with it through Mozart data, but I haven't heard a lot of the term CDP. Can you just explain what a CDP is, how marketers use CDPs, and why you're using this alternative term ETL?
Yeah, so I have never set up a CDP myself. I'm going to set the table with that, and so I apologize to anyone who has and who feel free to correct me. But CDPs are often used by brands to more accurately kind of track consumer behavior to even like a deeper kind of data layer level. I think of it as like a souped up GTM to some degree, because with Google Tag Manager you can create more events that are trackable, and things like tracking clicks on a banner so that you can track the click-through rate of one banner versus another. But I think the thing that a lot of brands are aiming to achieve with a CDP is in an ideal world, we can get all of our customers to log into the accounts on our sites and be able to track their behavior more specifically so that we can target our marketing better. As a consumer, I very rarely, sign into my accounts on a site, even if I have one. So with a CDP, a lot of times what you're aiming to do is kind of marry the pre-logged in profile of someone with the post-logged in profile of someone to kind of do better event tracking there. It's not something it's not something we personally use at Glamnetic. It's generally a little pricey. But I think, if you're thinking about kind of one potential loss loop of data, I would say it would be, that CDP piece of kind of connecting before someone's even in your email system to after they're in your email system.
Okay, so I will say we run a B2B company, so obviously sort of living on the opposite end of the world of DTC, and we think about eventing a lot, and we love capturing events, and then we love to try to use events to further our business. So, we live in sort of a different world where, yes, it happens to be the case when, you're billed on a per quote user basis. You can very quickly amass a large bill if you have a lot of low expected value users. And in the B2B context, obviously, typically deals are much higher size than in the DTC world. I am actually curious, without going too deep, what is a typical, an item or a basket at Glamnetic look like?
I'm not sure I can really share that number. I'll also say it varies between kind of our product costs, but that's not a number we really publicly share more broadly.
Sure, it's probably got an order of magnitude different than a lot of sort of B2B.
Yeah, I think the other important thing though is it's not just someone's first order. Like, I think you need to focus less on, AOV and focus more on LTV, which, for a lot of B2B companies is important as well. So I think another mistake people will make sometimes is just looking at, CAC to AOV ratio versus like CAC to LTV ratio. Because I think one thing within the D2C space, and especially within, consumable products, and we do have some degree of a consumable product with our liner and our nails, and ultimately go through our lashes, is, someone can look, less profitable at their first order, which I think is something more for D2C than for B2B. But over time, they can become a very profitable customer if you nurture them well enough. But bit of a tangent.
Not in full. So I think a lot of like, we'll call it usage-based SaaS companies look pretty consumery, like do want to have actually sort of the opposite, consumery, have like positive net dollar retention. So they actually, do have to think about, we just had like the Snowflake earnings announcement just yesterday, and there's a big brag on their net dollar. What basically means is that users come in, they spend a little, and they get sort of addicted to data, and then start consuming more and more of it. So there is these nice parallels. We come from sort of different worlds, but I kind of recognize some of the parallels. When you mentioned a term, LTV, lifetime value, you think about CAC to LTV ratio. The other way of thinking about it is payback period. These two are approximately the same. When something's good on payback period, it tends to be good on CAC to LTV ratio, though not necessarily, for a couple of reasons. And the edge cases are maybe less interesting. But why is that it does feel like there's a shift like today, towards payback as opposed to towards CAC LTV? Or are you seeing that? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of always operated within the realm of, our co-founder, our head of finance, and I will kind of focus on, contribution margin, payback period, everything like that. CAC to LTV is just kind of simpler for a lot of people to understand. And a lot of times, at least the businesses I've worked with, when you look at CAC to LTV, you're just looking at pure like marketing customer acquisition costs. And then LTV is pure like, whether it's net revenue or gross revenue, however you look at it. Whereas payback period, you're looking at, you're taking into account contribution margin, OpEx, COGS, like all the things that go into that. So I think as businesses are leaning more towards profitability focus versus just like growth above all, I think you need to be a little more conservative, and you need to take those costs into account, because I think, a lot of companies had ballooning OpEx, whether that's due to office costs, like team build out, like services that they were paying for, things like that. And if you're just looking at CAC to LTV, then that can just get completely out of control. And you could think, oh, my CAC to LTV looks great, but then you're, getting punched in the face by your OpEx and not tracking it closely.
Nice. I was going to make a joke that I work at a Silicon Valley tech company, so we rarely know, sort of know terms like, OpEx or put that into the equation. Can you talk a little bit about, working at a company that kind of isn't doing the, I'll call it like the venture capital, like craziness that sort of we've seen in 2021?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that our co-founders have spoken about a fair amount. So we are a, completely self-funded business. So, it's something where we just have to kind of, I think it's part of why we have to be so data-driven as a company, because it's, it's the sort of thing where, I'm not saying that this is the case for all companies, but, if you raise $100 million, like some things can fall through the margins and it's not going to be the end of the world. But if you're kind of tracking everything from a dollars in, dollars out standpoint, you have to just like, what feels like it might be a small, cost that someone forgot about for a few months can really be impactful. So it's, constantly focusing on our product costs, being a little more litigious with our marketing spend and making sure that, not just that we are being smart about it, but that the numbers check out. I think that's part of why we do our triangulation. It's all related, because, if we just relied on one platform, we might decide to just spend a ton, and then we suddenly realize, oh shoot, like this revenue does not line up. So it's why we have to kind of look at a bunch of things on a daily basis to make the right decisions there. So I think that's one thing that kind of drives the way that we operate.
Let me challenge you very, very, very strongly. You can be a well-funded startup and want to have great data infrastructure in place.
Oh, I'm not saying that's not the case. I think it's just part of why we invested in it.
I think it's like a real vote of confidence when a company that is bootstrapped wants to make that investment.
Yep.
We work with bootstrapped companies. We worked with the most well-funded, venture funded companies. We like them all, but it's certainly a real vote of confidence in the organization's belief about data when they're both bootstrapped and want to make the investments in the right type of infrastructure. So that's kind of awesome. One of the things that we haven't that we've talked about sort of more indirectly, and you talked about differences in performance in the channels. How do you think about sort of making inference on different cohorts? So a lot of times I think one of the traps of marketing is that you have a real inclination to look at means or historical means or anything that don't represent whatever the next cohort that you're bringing in is. It's like in some sense you use data because your belief about the past is that it informs the future. My first question to you is how do you think about cohorting? And then there is going to be a follow-up to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think cohorting cannot just be reliant on acquisition month. I like to cohort as many ways as humanly possible, and we've kind of set up our data systems to support that. So it can be by products, it can be by month, it can be by platform, it can be by what discount code you came in on. It's all of these different things. Did you buy lashes and nails at the same time in your first order? Did you just buy nails? It's kind of constantly tracking all the relevant retention rate metrics over time by slicing and dicing a bunch of different ways. So I use retention data with it, from cohorts, to make a lot of acquisition decisions. So I saw a platform that we saw had as an example, a less efficient customer acquisition cost than another platform. And we were kind of all right, should we be continuing to invest in this? Should we not? And then I looked at our retention rate and I saw that our retention rate on that platform was, significantly higher than our average, and especially versus the platform that we were going to push that money into. So I made the decision. I said, you know what? From a longer term CAC to LTV, payback period, whatever margin you want to go with, it's going to make sense to continue to invest in this platform, even if from a first purchase standpoint, it doesn't look like it's going to be as good.
It's funny that you say that. I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in cohorting. I sort of was leading in the direction of sort of historical mistakes that I've seen. One of the things that is a little bit challenging when you want to slice it so thin, I think you get, is that you have to have enough, volume to have meaningful signal, essentially, whether you think of it as shrinking the standard error on your estimate, or whether you think of it as just having just a sufficient size of cohort. Even when I worked at Bing, where we would have, billions of searches. So you're the N must be big enough, but you'd magically divide it by this and this and this and this, and the next thing we'd have 4 searches. Or, I mean, not really, but I think I think that one of the challenges is that there is, again, this art of the science, almost revisiting the topic that we were talking about earlier with respect to attribution, which is how do you actually have you've picked things that you think are very causal, the discount code, the source, these are things that you think of as really important and high signal, but you also want to leave kind of the right size of that cohort to have meaningful signal on it. I know we're almost out of time, but I want to sort of take that answer and go with what have been some sort of real gaffes or horror stories or mistakes that you've seen that might be from a data analytical approach, it might be from a data infrastructure issue. What have been some sort of avoidable mistakes or lessons that you think are important to impart?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of brands were starting to, or a lot of brands kind of got hit with mid last year was iOS and rolling in, like a lot of brands hadn't invested in creating that data infrastructure. So a lot of people were playing catch up and trying to get things into place. But the problem is with a lot of ways that you capture data, there's not a look back window. So you can like have great data capture rolling forwards, but you're not going to maybe, you can't go back and create a post-purchase survey that gives you demographic information about your buyers. You can't go back and get that information necessarily, or to do it, you have to invest a lot in it. So I think one piece is invest early and invest often in building out your data infrastructure when you're starting out. I think another thing is naming conventions. Like it sounds super basic, but this is across like wherever you go, just making sure you have religious adherence to a good consistent naming structure, because that determines what you can pull into these systems to do all these like slices and dices. And I've seen plenty of horror stories where I jump into an account and all the ads are named conversion ad 1 or conversion ad 2, and then you're working backwards, and you have to kind of it's just harder to figure out what was actually working and why. So I think those would be a couple key things.
Like I said, you've totally failed at the title of the talk, which was, basically how to do marketing data-driven analytics, because I feel like this is just a talk between two folks that are data leaders. These are pretty universal problems that everybody's sort of using data to assist in operations kind of challenge. And I'm also someone that's been very guilty of the past of incredibly bad naming conventions that has bitten me a number of times. So thanks for that. So we have hit time, but we're gonna go for another 5 minutes or so doing some Q&A. Maybe Cody, do you want to sort of take us through one of the questions we have? Oh,
Cody, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions we've got here is essentially, if you've got a smaller marketing team or a newer marketing team, what are some important early steps to kind of get that marketing team operating in as data-driven a manner as possible?
Yeah, I would say, just building off of what I've just said, naming conventions from day one, just so like any information you're capturing earlier, you can make better decisions with it, because that can lead to quicker aggregation over time. Even as simple as saying ads are like video versus static versus carousel. If you can aggregate across a bunch of different ads, it's just a very specific example, but you can see that all of your videos are outperforming versus another. So I think that's one piece. Another piece is just when you're building out that team and hiring that team, I love to hire quantitatively driven people first, and like people who are quantitatively driven first and marketers second. So, when I've hired entry-level people, a lot of times we ask for people who have backgrounds with, quantitative majors if they're coming out of college. So I think just setting your team up to think as quant people first and qual people second, I think will, be super helpful. I think those are two major things I would say.
Obviously, like I second a lot of these things, but I'm like super biased. I'm always like, a great place to start, tends to be the data. But I think that sort of one of the things I came away with, and that we talk a lot about at Mozart, is just this massive influx of people that can do sort of both. Sort of, and just in talking with you, I'm taking notes about some quantitative approaches that I like to think about. And my whole world for my entire career was you had to be in one of these camps. And I of course chose the quant camp. But it's really amazing to see that bridge connected mostly in this marketing world with this new title growth. But seeing data scientists that can write well, or seeing sales folks that are also sort of diving into their data and cutting it really appropriately. I think this trend that you're talking about of like sort of thinking quantitative first in pretty qualitative disciplines and then having that additional sort of dimension to it is like it used to be like this very rare unicorn, and now there's this population of folks that certainly do that well. And then like, then there's a population of tools, including Mozart Data, that are trying to serve them. So that's pretty awesome stuff. How have you actually gone and found, how have you become that person? And then how have you gone and generally found that person?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. People ask me, a lot of times like, oh, how do you learn data? How do you get good at data? Are there some courses I should take, like, et cetera, et cetera? And, there's some great webinars out there, some great classes, things like that. But honestly, like YouTube is such a great resource. I think you can just basically search any question that you have with any issue that you're having and find something and then fall down a, YouTube data rabbit hole. And then it kind of depends on like who you are as a learner. Like I know I'm a very hands-on learner. So for me, like if I'm trying to figure out how to do something, I'm just going to pull the data and start playing with it. But other people might be, okay, you need to go read a 30-page article about it, and that's going to help you figure it out more quickly. But in terms of finding people and recruiting the right people for this, I've done a lot of different case studies in the past that include like some basic like data manipulation, screening questions. What data systems have you used previously? How would you solve XYZ problem? So I think it's just about asking the right questions and giving some actual like hands-on examples for them to work through of what they would be doing on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome.
Well, great. And I think, with that, we'll wrap up our webinar here. If you attended this webinar as a guest, thank you so much for attending. We hope that this was a valuable conversation. I certainly thought so. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us today. It's been great to hear about, your experiences and, kind of the broad ways data can be, important in, growth. So, if you did attend this webinar, we'll be sending out an email with a link to the recording. So if there's anything you thought was valuable, you can return to that. And if you're looking to learn more about data infrastructure, data best practices, MozartData.com does have a lot of resources. And I think that perhaps the Startup's Guide to the Modern Data Stack on our data resources page is a kind of good comprehensive place to start if you're just getting going with some of those infrastructure decisions. And with that, thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Margaret.